Hi, I'm Len Rydell, Executive Director of the Blue and Gray Education Society. I'd like to welcome you to another lecture in our symposium on Two Great Rebel Armies, which was conducted in January of 1997 at the Menger Hotel in San Antonio, Texas. Our next speaker is Richard McMurry, whom you have met in other programs. Richard is one of the classics and one of the truly great historians of the Civil War that remains alive. Richard studied under the legendary Bell Wiley, the man who wrote Johnny Reb and Billy Yank, and whom was one of the deans of instruction for a new generation of historians that included McMurry and Herman Hathaway and Larry Hewitt and Bill Cooper and so many of these others who are now the deans and are retired, and who generated subsequent generations like Gary Gallagher and Pete Carmichael and people like that. So it's a real treat to again challenge Richard and ask him to draw on his corporate recollections and memories. What I asked him to do here was a touchy one, though. And it had to do, I'll have to admit, I had a personal prejudice in this, and I wanted to hear somebody like Richard, who is a VMI graduate. I wanted to hear his take on it because I was going to ask him to talk about a colleague. And anybody who understands professional courtesies and so forth understands that you may have very strong opinions about somebody, but in the vernaculars of the terms of professional courtesy is such that you don't badmouth them or attack them in public. That's just really, really bad form. And I'm so sorry to see that in some instances that has begun to become prevalent in our society and also in the history community, where a lot of non-professional historians perhaps have taken to attacking professional historians, and conversely, professional historians have either ignored or looked down their nose at the work of public historians and amateur historians, and that's not good, especially at a time when history itself is under attack. And so I didn't know what I would get from Richard when I asked him to talk about Dr. Tom Connelly, who at that time was a professor emeritus at the University of South Carolina. Tom was the mentor of many other great historians, guys like Dr. Steve Wise, who's a member of Blue and Gray, and Tracy Power and other people, where he drove people in a certain discipline as to what he expected of them as disciples of his school of historiography and how history ought to be approached and presented. I had wanted to tackle Connelly because I had had a mad on for some time over his book, The Marble Man, which he had written, and then also the Alan Nolan's book on Lee Reconsidered. And with those, and then of course you may remember last year, I had Charlie Rowland had written a rejoinder chastising Nolan and Connelly and writing a book on Lee Considered, or Recollecting Lee, I think it was, which was a monograph. And so I wanted to get this presentation from somebody else who was highly ranked in the field. And I'll be honest with you, while a very informative talk and very, very much in Richard's folksy vernacular, I was a little disappointed that he didn't take out the knives and tackle Tom on some of the issues. And so I'll take a minute or two here, probably more than a minute or two, but to give you some other perspective on this, so that maybe if you're interested, you may decide to go in and do a little further research on your own. What had me on Connelly's case, of course, what alerted me to Connelly was his work on Robert E. Lee. And then I had the opportunity and had just picked up within the last year, when I'd gone to Nashville and so forth. I had gone up and I found University of Tennessee publications that had been done on, it was a 2-volume set that Tom Connelly had done on the Army of Tennessee. I think one is called Autumn of Glory, and Army of the Heartland was the other. And so in reading those, that was a total history of the Southern war effort in the West in the Army of Tennessee. And as I read them, I found a consistency in there in which Connelly was just brutally dead on against the folks who led the Army of Tennessee. Didn't matter who they were; he just didn't have any time for them whatsoever, and was frankly going to take them on in a fashion which I didn't necessarily feel would do justice to what actually happened. Excuse me, I'm sitting in a place, and you'll see the sun is shifted around, and I've got to move over to another seat so that the sun just doesn't completely white out my face. So bear with me just a second as I move over to the other seat out of the direct sunlight. Sadly, I can't fix that at this stage because the blind broke, and I've got to put a new blind up. But anyway, because of Connelly's overt prejudice against them, I wanted to hear, was in fact the historiography of Tom Connelly, was that the issue, or was it the issue of leadership? Robert E. Lee in the East and various and sundry officers in the West. And I wanted somebody with Richard's experience to address that. And I don't think he does in this particular instance. But subsequent to that, I've had another 25 years to look at that. And experience has shown me, I went to look at for Connelly papers and other things he had published and stuff. And my conclusion was that Tom Connelly was, in fact, not an honest broker relative to leadership. I think he had an axe to grind. He didn't like people in authority. I believe, if I recollect, he may have served in the military as a junior officer. I would wonder what his experiences were with his commander. He had left that and he went into academia, and never missed an opportunity to bash somebody who's in command while defending the common soldier. In and of itself, there's nothing wrong with that, but for somebody of his stature, which he maintained all the way until his death some 15 years or so ago, I guess, he did color a lot of the arguments, and I think perhaps has a legacy, at least to my way of thinking, that is not as sparkling as some of the works of some of the other people. I think he had personal prejudices that I think spilled over into his writings. And so as you look at this, as you listen to Richard talk about this, that's my opinion, is a counter flow to that you may or may not find should be considered as you evaluate historiography, not only Connelly, but other people, because I would submit to you that the lesson from this, we as an educational organization are trying to help you do, just as Sam Hood did 10 years or so ago with a scathing expose on academic and historians' use of sources and citing of sources. I think all of you should be much better historians if you learn to be extremely skeptical about all that you read and all that even a quote professional historian unquote or an amateur historian cites to you. Buyer beware, do your own research, and if it seems odd to you or strange to you, go out and research it for yourself. That's the beauty of this discipline. So with that, I'm sure, ambivalent introduction to Richard McMurry, whom is certainly not at fault here. It's just a difference in outlooks. I, as the head of the organization, wanted to evaluate this because I thought that Connelly, that there was some fire there that maybe ought to be exposed. What I did learn is that there is a ring knocker society among professional historians, and you don't get bad book reviews if you're writing books, because if you give a bad book review to another historian, wait until you write a book and he gets to write a review on you. So it is a ring knocker society that is protective. So sit back, relax, and enjoy Richard McMurry. Talk about this in Richard McMurry. I was wondering if you have too many nachos and Doritos and
too many Manhattans and margaritas. I want to correct something that Lynn said. The class of 1961 at VMI was when men were men and women were grateful. I also want to point out that the theme of this conference was Lynn's idea, it was not mine. And in fact, I did not know either what the theme of the conference was going to be or what the topic of my talks were going to be until I read an advertisement in Civil War News a month or so ago. So Lynn, with his typical foresight and planning here, has got all of this worked out, and it's his doing. It's as I say, it's his idea, not mine. And if you've got your program, you will observe that I'm supposed to talk about this morning, I'm supposed to talk about the historiographic legacy of Tom Connelly, and tomorrow I'm supposed to talk about V.S. Freeman, R.E. Lee, and Lee's lieutenants. And this was the program that Lynn put together. But since Lynn did all of this without bothering to tell me about it, I've decided to change my topic without telling him about it until now. I thought it would be much better to do a talk on the use of the bayonet by Company E of the 3rd Cherokee Mounted Rifles at the Battle of Blue Ridge. Now, the topics that I'm going to do or try to do on the couple of days of this conference are really different from the other talks that you're going to hear. If you look at the other subjects that we will be talking about today and tomorrow, you will observe that they tend to focus on the armies themselves. But I'm supposed to talk about something different. I'm supposed to talk about two historians in the armies. I'm supposed to talk about what is known as the historiography of the two armies. That's a different subject. And so I'm going to change not really the topic I'm going to talk about, but the order in which I'm going to talk about them. And I think we can do this without doing great violence to the structure of the conference, since the rest of the talks will deal with the armies themselves, but I'm going to talk about the history of the historians who have written about the armies. Two separate subjects. And as Lynn said, and as I said, what I'm discussing is the historiography of the two Confederate armies. Historiography, for those of you who are not familiar with the term, is the history of history. You know, history is a human activity, and like all human activities, it has its own history. So when you study the history of history, it's called historiography, and that's what I'm going to talk about. But I'm not going to talk about Tom Connelly today in the historiography of the Army of Tennessee. I may not even get to Douglas Southall Freeman in the historiography of the Army of Northern Virginia. And if I don't, that's all right, because I have to do something tomorrow morning, and I've already done the ploy of coming in late to kill a few minutes of what I'm supposed to do. And so tomorrow I'll have to be here on time. And if I don't get to everything today that I want to get to today, then I'll get to it tomorrow, and we'll finish up again. But what I've decided to do is to change the order in which I talk about this. I'm doing this because I don't think you can possibly understand Thomas Lawrence Connelly and his influence on the military history of the Civil War without understanding Douglas Southall Freeman. You know, Freeman came before Connelly, and therefore it seems to me that it makes sense to talk about Freeman first and then talk about Connelly, because I think a lot of what Connelly had to say about the military history of the war is, in fact, a reaction to Freeman. And so to talk about Connelly first makes it difficult to follow what it was that Connelly himself was trying to do. So I want to talk about Freeman before I talk about Connelly. But before we can talk about Freeman, I think it's necessary to go back and take a look at the background in which Douglas Southall Freeman did his great and magnificent writing about the Army of Northern Virginia and about Robert E. Lee and about Lee's lieutenant. So what I want to start out with is a discussion of the background out of which came the writings of Douglas Southall Freeman and the ideas that Freeman expressed, and then we'll explore the ways in which Thomas Connelly was reacting to Freeman and to Freeman's ideas. To do this, we have got to look at something called the lost cause myth, or the myth of the lost cause. This is one of the fascinating things about the Civil War, is that so much of what we know about the Civil War, or so much of our understanding of the Civil War, really grows out of the attitudes of people after the Civil War, the decades after the Civil War, when the people who had participated in it, or the people who at least had lived through it, began to write about it. And if you focus on the southern part of that understanding, you begin to get into this mysterious, mystical realm in which both Douglas Southall Freeman and Thomas Lawrence Connelly lived and worked. So I want to begin with an exploration of this lost cause myth, ideas that white Southerners had about the Civil War, about the nature of the war, how it was conducted, and what it meant. And let me digress for a moment and point out that I'm going to try to remember to say white Southerners, because we lose sight of the fact sometimes that about 40% or so of the population of the South at the time of the Civil War was not white. And a lot of their ideas were not the same as the ideas held by the 55 or 60% of the Southern population that was white. Sometimes I may lapse, as people have tended to do over the years, and use the term Southerner when I really mean white Southerner. But I will try to make that distinction because it's an important one, as we'll see when we get into this. But white Southerners developed a whole set of ideas about their outlook on life, about their role in the United States, about their position in the Civil War. And what I want to do is try to take some time at the beginning this morning to sketch out what those ideas were. And then we'll look at how they influenced people like Douglas Freeman, and how in turn Freeman influenced people like Thomas Connelly. And I think to do this, we have to begin by looking at a set of beliefs that white Southerners developed prior to the Civil War. Because a lot of the Confederate or white Southern understanding of the Civil War goes back to and grows directly out of a set of antebellum beliefs that white Southerners had. Some people would use the term myths to refer to this set of beliefs. Some people make a distinction between myths and folklore and beliefs and that kind of thing. We're not going to fool with that. I'm going to just use the terms interchangeably. But we'll begin by just sort of cataloging some of these beliefs or myths that white Southerners held prior to the Civil War. Some of these, I should also add, many of them, in fact, were also shared by white people in the North. And some of them were shared by blacks, both North and South. So it's a set of pervasive beliefs that existed almost completely among white Southerners, and to a lesser extent among white Northerners, and to an even lesser extent still among blacks in both North and South. But I just want to catalog some of these that grew out of the early period, and then we'll talk in some more detail about some of them that developed later on. But if you had come into the South prior to the Civil War and had asked white Southerners, where do you folks come from? Where are your ancestors from? The answer that you would have gotten, and it would have been basically correct for almost all white Southerners, would be that our ancestors came from the British Isles. Because almost all white Southerners at the time of the Civil War were of British, and many of them of English descent, although there were large percentages of Scotch and Irish in the population as well. But they came from the British Isles. More specifically, white Southerners would have maintained that their ancestors were members of the English aristocracy. This is a set of beliefs that was widely held in mid-19th century America, that white Southerners are descended from the feudal Norman aristocracy of England. So these are the people who came across the Channel in 1066 with William the Conqueror. They took over England. They ruled England as the British or English aristocracy. They imposed their rule on the Welsh, the Scotch, the Irish. Our ancestors, white Southerners, would have said in 1860, are the descendants of the English aristocracy. The aristocracy was the military class. So our ancestors, almost genetically as it were, are qualified as military people because of this background from which they come. Whereas the northerners, the white northerners, tend to be descended from the Anglo-Saxons of the British Isles, the low class, the scum of the British Isles. I was giving a talk on a similar theme to the New Orleans Civil War Roundtable one time. There's this wonderful fella down there, now retired, used to be a petroleum engineer. He's the unreconstructed rebel type. His retirement funds are invested in Confederate war bonds. this sort of guy. And I was describing how this belief was widely held, that white Southerners were noble members of the aristocracy and elite military leaders, and white Northerners were the descendants of the low-class scum, cowardly, worthless mud seals of English society. And he was sitting in the back of the room nodding. But this was the belief widely held in the mid-19th century. Southerners like to read the novels of Sir Walter Scott and think of themselves as Ivanhoe and Quentin Durwood, gallant knights galloping around, rescuing ladies fair from dragons and that sort of thing. This whole myth that the South is the land of the Cavaliers, whereas the North is the land of the low-class people of the British Isles. This is a false belief. We know now, thanks to historians who've gone back and looked at this, that white Northerners and white Southerners were descended from the British middle classes. And why should some English nobleman come to live in the boondocks in North America when he could live in a castle in England somewhere? And the fact is that British aristocrats did not come to North America, except as military officers or government officials for short periods of time. And most of them who came here spent a great bulk of their time and energy scheming to get back to the bright lights and teeming flesh pots of London and out of the backwoods boondocks of Boston and Williamsburg and Charleston and all of the other worthless hick towns that the British government sent them to. But it's what people believe that's important. If people believe something is true, they act on that basis. So we're talking about beliefs. We're not talking about facts. And the first belief is that the white Southerners are this almost genetically, as it were, military class, the nobility, the cavaliers of the English Isles who came here, and that white Southerners therefore are militarily superior to these low-class people in the North. A second idea that was widely held among whites in the South was that slavery was a positive good. We don't have time to get into the background of the argument over slavery here, but very general statement, let me say that there was a time when a lot of leading Southerners like Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, George Washington, they had doubts and reservations about slavery. It was something they inherited, it was something they were stuck with, but they tended to think of it as a necessary evil in their society. But in the 1830s, Southerners began to change the way in which they thought about slavery. And they came to view slavery as a positive good. And then by the 1840s and 1850s, they're arguing that slavery is a moral institution. And that good people believe in slavery and they support slavery. And that slavery is good both for whites and for blacks. As I say, we don't have time to get into a lot of the details on this, but this debate over slavery and the changing Southern view of slavery in the 1830s and 1840s is one of the more important events of the antebellum period. A third belief that Southerners developed and held prior to the Civil War was the idea that within the United States, sovereignty remained with the states, not with the federal government. This was an idea that really came to fruition in the thinking and writing of John C. Calhoun. in the late 1820s and 1830s and 1840s. And you can argue back and forth about whether or not Calhoun was right. You know, the Constitution does not specifically say about which is more important, which is more powerful, the federal government or the state government. Southerners convinced themselves in the 1830s and 40s and 50s that sovereignty lay with the states, and that a person's first loyalty was due to his state, not to the federal government. Some of them even carried it to the point of believing that one's loyalty was due to the state of one's birth. And I have come across instances of Southerners who were living in places like Minnesota and California, had been there for years. When the Civil War began, they packed up and came back to the South because that was where their loyalty was due. And they fought in the Confederate Army, and then sometimes after the war, they went back to Minnesota or California. And it's like if you're an American living in, say, Europe, and the United States gets in a war with some European country, you come home, join the American army, go fight the European country, then when the war is over, you go back and live in Paris or wherever it was that you were living. But almost without exception, white Southerners in the antebellum period believed that sovereignty lay with the states, and that the federal Constitution was a compact, which a state could leave if it so chose. And thus, when a state seceded from the Union, it would be acting in accordance with this interpretation of the Constitution. And this, of course, is the very point on which people like Abraham Lincoln disagreed with people like Jefferson Davis. Finally, a fourth belief that white Southerners held in the antebellum period that figured into all of this was that in the 1820s and 30s and 40s and 50s, the North deliberately and consistently violated the constitutional rights of the South. And if you had gone to white Southerners in, say, 1855, and had asked questions like this, you would have gotten some interesting answers. Well, just how is the North violating your constitutional rights? Is the North trying to wipe out freedom of the press in the South? Well, no. White Southerners had pretty much done that. Is the North trying to wipe out? Well, they had. You know, you couldn't publish anti-slavery information in the South in the 1850s, for example. Was the North trying to wipe out freedom of religion in the South? No. White Southerners were doing that. Was the North trying to wipe out freedom of speech, trial by jury, habeas corpus? No, no. White Southerners were taking care of it. Well, what was the North doing that violated Southern constitutional rights? Well, what the North was doing was opposing the expansion of slavery into the Western territories. And Southerners viewed that as a violation of the constitutional rights of the South. It's like that Confederate prisoner said in the movie Gettysburg. You remember when they captured that guy?
We fighting for our rights.
Fight for rights. So what are you people fighting for? We fighting for our rights. Rats. Rats.
Rats.
Rats.
We fighting for our rats.
There he is, right back there. But all of these ideas then, the idea that white Southerners are descended from the British aristocracy, the idea that slavery was a moral good, the idea that a state had the constitutional right to withdraw from the Union if it wanted to, and the idea that the North was violating the rights of the South. All of these ideas developed in the antebellum period. So they existed prior to the time of the Civil War. And as we'll see, they became an important part of this attempt to interpret not only the war in general, but also the war's military history and the historiography of these two armies. Another set of ideas, some of them elaborations or offshoots of these antebellum beliefs, developed during the Civil War itself, when Confederate Southerners would sit around the campfires or sit around the bars in Richmond or Chattanooga or Atlanta or just talk about what was going on. They would express a number of other ideas. You find a lot of this, for example, in the Confederate newspapers, running through the editorials and the reporting of the news by Confederate newspapers. They maintained, for example, that in seceding and making itself an independent country, that the Confederacy, or more accurately the Southern states, had each acted in accordance with the Constitution. That there's nothing illegal, nothing immoral, nothing treasonous about secession. You know, we did something legal, constitutional, moral when we seceded from the United States. Confederates believe that, you know, sincerely and deeply. They also believed during the Civil War that God was on the side of the Confederacy. Now this, of course, is not a unique belief to the Confederates at war. God has been on every side of every battle, every war that has ever been fought. And the Confederates believed that he was on their side during the Civil War, and that God's purpose is going to work out through all of this, and we go through this great suffering and trial and ordeal of the Civil War, but in the end, God's purposes will become clear because we are in the right and God will be on our side. I once heard the great historian C. Van Woodward talking about how he grew up in Arkansas and went to school in Georgia and North Carolina, and he learned at the very beginning of his life almost, at his mother's knee as it were, that Robert E. Lee was the greatest general who ever lived, and Stonewall Jackson was wonderful. And he went on and on and on about how all of this happened, and it wound up with that God, his questioning that he ultimately came to was, if Robert E. Lee was so good, if Stonewall Jackson was so fast on his feet, if one Confederate soldier could whip 10 Yankees with both hands tied behind his back, if God was really on our side, then how in the hell did we lose? And he had to explain this. But the Confederates believed during the Civil War that God was on their side. They also believed, as I mentioned, that the Yankees were cowards and that one Confederate could easily whip all of the Yankees that there ever were. Yankees, you see, are this low-class scum from the low classes in the British Isles, because many white Northerners believed that, as did many white Southerners. The Confederates believed that they were winning. And if the Yankees happened to win some specific battle, it was because they were drunk. And you can read almost every Southern newspaper when there's an account of some battle in which the Yankees won. It was because the Yankees were drunk. The Yankee commanders got their soldiers drunk, and this turned them into this mighty fighting machine that the Confederates lost to that day. But God is on our side, and we'll get them next time. Also, and this is most important, during the Civil War, the Confederates came to look toward Robert E. Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia as the embodiment of these beliefs. Thomas Connelly, as we'll see, questions this. Thomas Connelly maintains that the Confederates had other heroes than Robert E. Lee during the Civil War. And this is certainly true in the early part of the Civil War. But the more I read in the history of the Civil War, the more I am convinced that by 1863, possibly even by late 1862, Confederates everywhere from Texas to Virginia and Florida to Arkansas looked toward Robert E. Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia. That was their hope. That was what they saw as the embodiment of all of these virtues of the wartime Confederacy. So these ideas that the Confederates held during the war itself, that they were acting morally, legally, ethically, in seceding constitutionally, that God was a Confederate, that Yankees were cowards, that the Confederates were winning, and above all, for our purposes, this idea of looking toward Virginia and Robert E. Lee as the hope of the Confederacy and the embodiment of these Confederate/Southern beliefs about themselves and the war in the North. Well, as you know, God decided for reasons of his own that the Confederacy was not going to win the war, and the Confederacy lost. And this brings us into a third period of trying to explain and interpret this, the immediate early post-war period. This is a fascinating period from roughly, say, 1865 to 1875 or so, when the Southerners were trying to explain what had happened to them. Historians are very much aware of the fact that during this period, white Southerners coming out of the wreckage of the Confederacy were demoralized, depressed, dispirited, they were crushed. They had literally put everything they had into this effort to win independence. They had seen more than 250,000 of the finest young men in the South dead, either killed on the battlefield or dying from disease in the filthy hospitals. They saw another, nobody knows how many hundreds of thousands of men without arms, without legs, an eye or both eyes gone, a jaw gone, men who came home from the war severely wounded. They saw schools and cities destroyed, railroads torn up, livestock slaughtered, crops burned, and just the devastation that spread across the South. They were crushed by all of this, psychologically as well as militarily. And in the period immediately after the Civil War, they turned to trying to explain this, to reconcile what had happened to them with their deep beliefs about themselves and about their country and about religion. There are two facets of this that we need to look at just briefly here. One of them is the fact that Southerners, white Southerners, in this aftermath of defeat, desperately needed something to bolster their self-esteem. You know, we went into this war just totally, absolutely convinced that we were going to win everything, this great triumphant victory, we would gain our independence, and we lost. How can we explain this? They didn't put it this way because they weren't consciously verbalizing it, but what they needed was something that would shore up their sense of honor, their belief that they had acted legally and morally in what they had done. They needed something that would bolster their self-image in this aftermath of defeat. They also needed for the North to acknowledge the honor and the courage of white Southerners. This is how they would get back their self-respect. This great need to shore up their self-esteem. At first, in the period that we're talking about, say 1865 to the early 1870s, this often took the form of some sort of ceremonial act about commemorating the Confederacy, or at least commemorating the Confederates, to honor the Confederate soldiers. And as Gaines Foster points out in his wonderful book, Ghosts of the Confederacy, many of these early Confederate memorial activities took place in cemeteries, perhaps symbolic in more ways than they realized. But they would hold memorial meetings of some sort that ultimately evolved into Memorial Day in Confederate cemeteries. They would decorate the graves of the Confederate dead. They would bring home the bodies of Confederate soldiers killed at Gettysburg for burial in the sacred soil of the South. What was that organization? I was trying to find this. I'm not certain it's in the book. I know it's in the movie Gone with the Wind. You remember after the war where Rhett Butler is trying to become respectable, and one of the things he does is donate money. Of course, he did that during the war too, but he had an ulterior motive then. He was trying to get Scarlet. But after the war, he donated money to an organization. Remember Aunt Pitty Pat, Scarlett's aunt in Atlanta, and she's saying one time something like, "Oh, Captain Butler made such a generous donation to the," I forget what it was, the Association for the Identification, Preservation, and Beautification of the Graves of the Glorious Dead. And that's the kind of thing that took place immediately after the Civil War. The Confederates were going to identify and preserve and decorate the graves of the Confederate dead. The monuments that were erected to Confederates in the immediate post-war period were erected in cemeteries. Perhaps, Gaines Foster suggests, because that was one place where they could be fairly certain that the Yankee occupation forces would not tear them down if they put them in the cemeteries. When they thought about the larger picture of the Civil War during this roughly 5 to 10 years immediately after the war, white Southerners continued to maintain that most white Southerners continued to maintain that the Confederacy had acted legally and constitutionally in seceding. Thus, Alexander Hamilton Stevens could write a massive and massively boring book called A Constitutional View of the Late War Between the States. in which he asserted that the Confederacy had been acting in accordance with the Constitution when it withdrew from the Union, and that the Confederacy had not been fighting for slavery. As you probably know, this contrasts quite sharply with what Stevens said during the war, particularly in his famous Cornerstone speech about the Confederacy being created with slavery as its cornerstone. That was the basic fundamental part of the Confederacy, he said in 1861. But this is carrying over, you see, this pre-war view and this wartime view that the Confederates had been acting in accordance with the law. They had been acting, hurry up, I'm going to have to look at my notes in a minute, thank you. They had been acting in accordance with the Constitution and the law, and they had not done anything illegal when they seceded. Great emphasis on this is the war, but this is not a civil war. This was a war between two independent countries. And by definition, a war between two independent countries cannot be a civil war. So argued Alexander Stephens. Although, as somebody pointed out, if Stephens were being logical and consistent, he would have to call it the war among the states, because he would maintain that each state was separate and sovereign. Or as a friend of mine once suggested long ago, when the adjective cotton picking is widely used, or get your cotton picking hands off the vine. Well, we've heard that many a time. The war between the cotton picking states and the other states. But this is what most white Southerners were doing in the immediate post-war period. They were salving their wounds, sometimes literally, but more often psychological wounds, from the burden and trauma and destruction and wreckage and casualties of the war. But there was another tradition in the South that I want to digress and just mention for a moment, because there's a wonderful article in the last November issue of the Journal of Southern History by Jeff Crow in North Carolina about another competing version of the Civil War and interpreting it that was suggested in the late 1860s and early 1870s by some white Southerners, particularly in the case of the article that Jeff wrote, Thomas W. Settle of North Carolina. Thomas W. Settle was a scalawag. And if you're familiar with terms that were used in American history, you know that scalawag was a term that was used in the South in the decade after the Civil War to refer to native white Southerners who joined and supported the Republican Party in the South. These, what Jeff is getting at in his article is that there grew up a debate in the South about what should the South do in the aftermath of the war. Should the South wallow in self-pity and glorify the Confederacy, or should the South strike out in new directions? And Thomas W. Settle and the other scalawags in the South were white Southerners who thought that the South should try to get over its past and to move in another direction, in the direction of developing industry, in the direction of developing better schools for the South, of at least granting some civil rights to black Southerners and moving along in that direction. And what Jeff Crow is getting at in this article is that one of the subjects of debate between the scalawags on the one hand and what from now on I'm going to call the Confederate Southerners on the other hand was this debate over the nature of the Civil War. And this is important because it shows us that not all white Southerners agreed with what became the myth of the lost cause. Some white Southerners disagreed with it almost at the very beginning of this period. Because people, scalawags like Thomas W. Settle, suggested and argued and tried to convince North Carolinians in the 1860s and 1870s that the Civil War and the establishment of the Confederacy had been a great mistake. Legal or not, it didn't matter, but it was stupid, is what Settle would say. That during the war, white Southerners had suffered greatly, not only from the federal invasion, but also from the actions of Confederates. Crow cites as an example one of the experiences Settle had as a civil official in North Carolina when Confederate conscription forces, the people trying to capture draft dodgers, came into the area, and they were trying to run down Unionist sympathizers and draft dodgers, and among other things, they would torture pregnant women, trying to force them to reveal where their husbands were if they were dodging the Confederate draft. You take a pregnant woman and tie her up on her toes like this with her thumbs up like this for a while to make her try to tell you where her husband is, because you know he's around somewhere and you want to get him and force him into the Confederate Army. Several cited examples like that to point out that the Civil War in North Carolina meant suffering, it meant pain, it meant the tyranny of government, both the state government and the Confederate government, and that it brought a great deal of suffering. And he wanted the people of the South to turn away from this Confederate tradition and to turn instead toward the tradition of rebuilding the South and developing its economic and human resources. All of this came to a head in North Carolina in the gubernatorial election of 1876, where Settle ran for governor against Zebulon B. Vance. And they debated, among other things, the nature of the Civil War and the nature of the Confederate experience. Vance won. And this is Vance won, and Vance, not so much Vance himself, but his adherents, took up the idea that the Confederacy was this glorious thing, and that we should honor the Confederates, and we should commemorate the Confederates. And instead of stressing the suffering that the war brought, we should stress the glory, the military glory of the Confederacy, and the honor of the Confederacy. And Vance and the Confederate Democrats, Confederate Southerners, sometimes called conservatives, sometimes called redeemers, these people won control of the government of North Carolina. They gradually won control of the governments of the other southern states. They used these ideas about the Confederacy as a political weapon. See, if you are one of the conservative / Confederate / Democrat politicians running in North Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, wherever, in 1868, 1870, 1874, this is a weapon that you can use against your Republican opponent. Where was my Republican opponent during the war? Why, he was home. Or in some cases, since the Republicans were people who had been in the Union Army, he was one of the Yankees who came down south. Or the Republican is a black. That was even worse. So that the Confederate tradition became a weapon in the political arsenal of conservative Confederate Democrats in this battle to control the South in the 1860s and 1870s. And as I mentioned, in North Carolina and everywhere else, gradually the conservative Confederate Democrats won this battle. And they managed to use the glory of the Confederate tradition as a part of their weapon. If you are interested in this and get a chance, that's a wonderful article. It's in the November 1996 issue of the Journal of Southern History. Well, some other things were going on, too, that were to have an impact on the way in which Southerners approached the Civil War. One of them was the death of Robert E. Lee in 1870. And you probably know Lee died in Lexington, Virginia in October 1870. And almost immediately, organizations sprang into being to try to seize the memory of Robert E. Lee, or at least to seize the power to interpret Robert E. Lee as they wished to do so. There were Lee memorial organizations here, there, everywhere across the South. The most important, as you might suspect, were in Virginia, where there was a big debate over whether Lee was to be buried in Richmond or in Lexington, and a big movement to erect a massive monument to Lee. Should that monument be in Richmond or in Lexington? And eventually Mrs. Lee settled the question of where he was to be buried. He was to be buried in Lexington. And they argued about the monument for a while and decided to put that in Richmond. So Lexington got the body in the Lee family grave site. Richmond got the big monument. You can go there to Monument Avenue today and see it there, the great equestrian monument to Lee that Douglas Southall Freeman used to salute every morning when he drove by going to work. And there were monuments to Lee erected all over the rest of the South. The University of Texas campus has a monument of Lee. There's a monument of Lee in New Orleans. There are Lee Streets, Lee Circles, Lee Parks, all over the South, named for Lee. Out of it. Out of this agitation after the death of Lee, there emerged a group of Southerners, former Army officers led by Jubal Anderson Early, former Lieutenant General Obajube Early, who actively campaigned for and succeeded in gaining control of the interpretation first of Lee and then on a larger scale of Confederate history. These people, for simplicity's sake, we can call the irreconcilables. They were bitter, angry men, unhappy with Confederate defeat. Many of them were men who themselves were subjected to severe criticism for what they had done during the war. And they saw this as an opportunity to vindicate, number one, themselves, and number two, the South. They wanted to explain defeat of the Confederacy in a way that would salve their minds and their souls, and they wanted to vindicate their personal conduct during the war. So that you have a movement which Thomas Connelly describes in his book, The Marble Man, and which Gaines Foster describes in this Ghosts of the Confederacy. You have a movement growing out of this that dominated Southern thought about the Civil War for roughly a decade in the 1870s. They refined this Confederate tradition that had developed from the antebellum period and the wartime period, and it had triumphed with the victory of Vance and the conservative Confederate Democrats over Settle and the Republicans and the Scalawags. And this tradition, this Confederate tradition, this lost cause tradition, as Early and the Irreconcilables defined it, went something like this. And as I describe this, you'll see how this is the evolution of these antebellum and wartime ideas. First off, the South, the antebellum South, was a golden age in American history. You know, this was the age of virtue. That was when Southerners were these noble, gallant cavaliers. They lived in this wonderful utopian society where white Southerners were all the chivalrous, militaristic, brilliant, intelligent, wonderful, honest, moral, decent, educated people, and where the plantations were worked by happy darkies in cotton fields, chopping cotton and singing songs. Now, this was the golden age of American history that existed in the antebellum South. This golden age was disrupted by the coming of the Yankee abolitionists, who challenged and attacked this golden civilization of the antebellum South. Here was slavery, this moral, legal, noble, wonderful institution, being attacked and undermined by these impolite, loud-mouthed, shrieking Yankee abolitionists who did not understand, who did not care anything for the law, and who would not appreciate anything about this wonderful civilization in the South. These attacks on the South, of course, were in direct violation of the constitutional rights of the Southern states and the Southern people. Thus, the Confederate cause was legal. That is, secession, the establishment of the Confederacy, was legal. It was not immoral. It was not treasonable. It was legal. Not only was it legal, but it was also a noble and just cause, a moral cause. By doing this, Early and the Irreconcilables established a Confederate claim to patriotism. The Confederates were not rebels, they were patriots, fighting for their country. The war, of course, is now the war of Northern aggression, brought about by the Northern abolitionists. Once you've established the nobility of the Southern cause, Early and the Irreconcilables then went on to praise Southern military capabilities. After all, we know Southerners are the descendants of the militaristic aristocracy of England, and therefore they are by definition and by genetics great military leaders. Proof? Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson. You might say, well, what about the Confederates in the West? Oh yeah, they were great too, but let's talk about the deployment of the 3rd Virginia on the 2nd day of the 7 Days battles. Well, what about Joe? Oh, he was a great general. Now let's talk about the location of the latrine of Company E of the 14th Virginia Cavalry on June 14th, 1864. You want proof the Confederates were great military leaders, Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson. Occasionally they might mention Jeb Stuart. And if they'd had a lot to drink and were really pressed on the subject, they might trot out A.P. Hill. But see what Early and these people are getting at now. When they want to praise Confederate military leadership, look at Virginia. Don't look anywhere else, or you really have problems trying to praise it. Now somehow Braxton Bragg, Joe Johnston, John Bell Hood, Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson are proof. And this is all that we're going to talk about. Lee himself, in this interpretation, was depicted as a almost perfect man, a man of flawless character, a man of supreme military ability, a man who inspired his heroic soldiers, so that indeed one Confederate could defeat 10 Yankees with both hands tied behind his back. Lee became the symbol of this interpretation of the antebellum South and the Civil War. And Lee was proof of the nobility and glory of Southern civilization. Lee was proof of the superiority of Confederate military leadership. And if this was the case, then how did he lose? And this is the question that C. Van Woodward posed. How did he lose? Two answers came out of this from Early in the Irreconcilables. One, overwhelming numbers. Now, never mind that this contradicts the idea, you see, that one Confederate could defeat 10 Yankees. We lost, said Early in the Irreconcilables, because of overwhelming numbers. Overwhelming numbers and resources, General Lee said in his farewell order to the Army of Northern Virginia. But, said Early, might does not make right. So by believing this, the Confederates, Southerners, post-bellum Southerners, the conservative Southerners, could believe that they were still acting, they had done right, that God was still with them even though they had lost. And there's some great divine cosmic mystery behind this that we do not understand now. But that eventually, in the fullness of God's own time, we will understand. Second explanation for why we lost, Longstreet. Longstreet at Gettysburg. If Longstreet had just done what General Lee told him to do, we would have won, said Jubal Early. Of course, you're familiar with the historiography of Gettysburg. You know there's good reason to question Early's role at Gettysburg. But by attacking Longstreet, Early diverts attention from this. They shift the attention to July 2nd and Longstreet's role around on the right of the Confederate line and hope that nobody will look at the left of the Confederate line on July 1st, which is where Early was. So you attack Longstreet. Besides, Longstreet was the only one in the hierarchy of the Army of Northern Virginia until almost the very end of the war who was not a Virginian. So all Virginians can rally around and attack Longstreet. You know, this funny guy with that beaver that's taken up residence on his chin if you saw the movie Gettysburg. So you blame defeat on overwhelming numbers and on James Longstreet. Very quickly, I'm going to finish up with this and then we'll continue this tomorrow. There are a couple of byproducts that came out of this that we need to know because these are absolutely crucial in understanding Douglas Freeman and Tom Connelly. We'll mention them now and then we'll start here and elaborate on this a little bit tomorrow. By doing this, by putting the emphasis on Lee and Jackson and their personal and military virtues, and by stressing Longstreet at Gettysburg, Early and the Irreconcilables focused the attention of writers and thinkers about the war directly on the Eastern Theater. They had a publication, the Southern Historical Society Papers. The Southern Historical Society was the organization through which Early and the Irreconcilables carried out a lot of this activity. And if you look at the Southern Historical Society Papers, probably at least 75% of the articles that are published in there are articles about the war in Virginia, Maryland, and Pennsylvania. Occasionally they would mention something had gone on somewhere else. But the focus is on Virginia and the Eastern Theater and Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia. And there's just this torrent of writing about that subject. Another second thing that came out of this that we might note just very briefly was not just Virginia, but Richmond. The city of Richmond became the center of this activity. So the Confederate activities beginning in the 1870s and accelerating for the next 30 or 40 years tended to focus right down on Virginia in general and on Richmond in particular, so that Richmond became the center of Confederate memorial and commemorative activities. And finally, last, just parenthetically, we might note a pitiful effort on the part of Confederates in other areas to create a role in all of this for Joseph E. Johnston, centering around Joseph E. Johnston in the Atlanta campaign. They got almost nowhere at the time because Early and the Irreconcilables did not want to talk about the Atlanta campaign or anything else outside Virginia. But what we're getting at by all of this is that by the early 1880s, Confederate memorial activities had tended to evolve to the point where they stressed almost exclusively the war in Virginia, the virtues of Robert E. Lee, and that these ideas came to dominate Southern thinking and Southern writing on the subject. And it is no coincidence that Douglas Southall Freeman was born in 1886, 6 years after all of this had sort of solidified, and that when he was 5 years old, his family moved to Richmond. I think occasionally he got out of Richmond after that physically, but I don't think he ever got out of Richmond psychologically. But we'll talk about Douglas Freeman and have questions and discussions in Tom Connelly tomorrow. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ray. Questions?
And try to get out of it. Yes.
Albion Seed was a book that was written by Fisher. Are you familiar with that one?
I have not read it. I know about it. It's about the immigration of...
Seed was a book that was written by Fisher. Are you familiar with that one?
I have not read it. I know about it. It's about the immigration of people from different areas of the British Isles to the American colonies.
He comes to the conclusion that possibly the southern British people who were pro-loyalists came with this myth of the Cavalier and brought it with them. And then with that, they also brought in primogeniture, which meant that the first oldest son got all the lands, and then an honorable occupation was going into the military. And so this kind of brought the tradition of DMI and all the other institutions that we have, and the attitude about military superiority.
As I say, I have not read Albion Seed. That's David Hackett Fisher, I believe.
Oh, that's his name.
Is that his name? I think
Fisher's his last name.
David Hackett Fisher. Herman says so, so it's got to be so. I'm vaguely familiar with it. I have not read it. He tries to trace people coming to the various colonies from different areas of the British Isles. But even if it's right, the bulk of the people who came out of the middle class, and that there's no coming of the English aristocracy in any sort of genetically. One of the things I was going to mention tomorrow is that Freeman almost genetically traces things like this. Robert E. Lee inherited such and such a trait from this ancestor. And you really that just doesn't work. The biology of the thing doesn't work, is the problem.
So all those people that came in the indenture, obviously, they're not coming from the class.
No upperclassmen, one member of the British aristocracy, Thomas Lord Fairfax, came to live in the American colonies. No other member of the British aristocracy was here except as a military, naval officer, government official.
But not as an indentured servant.
No. Someone over here, there's another hand up.
Yeah, I
Yes.
did. No one ever mentions the fact that most Southern soldiers were fighting as their grandfathers had fought against the British in the Revolutionary War. The same causes that they were fighting for then were the same causes that the colonists were fighting for over the Navigation Acts and mercantilism. And they believed, sincerely, that the North was imposing mercantilism upon the South through the use of the tariff and through the use of the Northern fleet. And I've never heard that mentioned by anybody as one of the basic causes for that friction.
Well, there were instances when North and South got into arguments in the 1820s and 30s about the tariff. Yeah, I have very difficult problems believing that that had much to do with the coming of the war, because if that was what brought on the war, then why didn't the Southern states secede in 1830 when there was a protected tariff? Why did they wait 30 years to secede? When there was, by 1860, the tariff had been reduced and virtually eliminated. And you know, I just have difficulty. There were economic disagreements between North and South. You're absolutely right about the tariff and about industrializations and other things. I just question whether that had anything to do with the coming of the war, because those differences existed for so long before the war that I don't think they would have had anything to do with the coming of the war in 1860. But the key, as I said, is what these people believed, because they were acting on the basis of their belief, not on the basis of what really was. And you're right, you know, they believed these things, but that doesn't mean that those things were true. Anything else?
I have one story from real life to enhance what you said. When I went to Richmond to receive the Jefferson Davis, the first Jefferson Davis Award 20-some years ago for my biography of S.D. Lee, I went and stayed and looked around, and I went to the R.E. Lee house where there's a bookstore where Mrs. Lee had lived during the war. And Tom Connelly's book was quite the rage at that time, you know.
This is The Marble Man.
The Marble Man. And they had this whole store of books dedicated to about Lee and Virginia, et cetera, et cetera. And I said, you guys don't seem to have the Marble Man here. Well, we're never going to have it either, that awful man. We can't help it that the war, after all, was fought in Virginia.
I'm surprised they didn't have the Marble Man up there and you could throw darts and other things at it.
I mean, in the toilet.
Yeah, did you check in the men's room to see if perhaps the Marble Man had been put to some use in there, along with photographs of Tom himself?
That was in the bottom of the chamber pot.
Yeah, that's right. You could get chamber pots in New Orleans with Ben Butler's picture in them, and in Richmond they have Tom Connelly's picture. I have a friend in Richmond who took that book out in his backyard and burned it once he read it. We'll talk a bit about this tomorrow, but you're right. They have this idea, you see, that the war was fought in Virginia. I have a friend who's a member of a Civil War group in the District of Columbia, and it's one of these groups where a member of the group gives a program each month. You know, like this month I'll talk about something, next month you talk about something, next month you talk about something. And each month, the person who's doing the program next month gives up and gives them a little sort of teaser about what next month's program is going to be. And so my friend, who is from the far southwest, you know, I mean even west of here, decided one time that he was going to do a program on the Confederate invasion of New Mexico for this group, and the Battle of Glorieta and all of that. And so his little teaser was, I'm going to tell you about a Western campaign. And that was all he told them. And the next month he came in to discover that they had a pool as to what he was going to talk about. And the consensus was that he was going to talk about the Shenandoah Valley. Anything else? Yes.
Looking through the Southern Historical Society papers, and you could just see the almost pathological dislike by Early. Is there any record during the actual war of them two having a direct conflict, or just really getting into it with each other?
Early and Longstreet?
Yeah.
Not to my knowledge. Ed, did you know?
No. They're kind of detached from each other.
Yeah, that's right. Early was in the Second Corps.
Right. I've always wondered that because you can just read after it was all, and they fought through correspondence afterwards and through allies. But I was wondering if there was ever an actual seed event during the war when they ran into each other and actually had a intense dislike of each other.
Well, if Ed says no, that means no. I mean, I'm sure they knew each other.
Closest they would ever served in each other would be at Williamsburg,
Right.
where Early gets wounded real fast.
And he
He's
was
going to have a
brigade-
dispute, then it's going to be over with D.H. Hill.
Okay, he was a brigade commander
Yeah.
there, as I recall. So. Anything else? Okay, we'll continue this tomorrow, and we'll actually get to the subject of my talks. Thank you very much.